So thank you, Claire. Good afternoon, and thanks so much to all of you for joining us. I'm so pleased to be here with Professor Nicholas Epley. I loved his new book, A Little More Social: How Small Changes Create Unexpected Happiness, Health, and Connection. I agree with best-selling author Daniel Gilbert, who said that this is, quote, one of those rare books that might actually change your life. So Nick's approach is pretty straightforward: being a little more social, seeking connections, initiating conversations with strangers, expressing gratitude, doing kind acts. Any and all of that will have really positive effects on our well-being and our outlook. The result can be indeed unexpected happiness. And this is all backed up by scientific research and case studies. At a time when the world can feel so disconnected and polarized and even lonely, a little more social feels particularly timely. So the book really resonates for me, as my late father was a man who never met a stranger. He was curious and friendly and had just this uncanny ability to jump right into people's hearts. For him, it was unstudied and quite natural, and I see him very much in Nick's pages. So we're going to be talking about the book, about Nick's background, and how we can all learn to make connections that really matter. The format for today is that I'm going to briefly introduce Nick, and then we're going to have a conversation, and we'll leave some time for your questions, which you can ask him directly. So very briefly, Nicholas Epley is the John Templeton Keller Professor of Behavioral Science and Faculty Director of the Roman Family Center for Decision Research at the University of Chicago Booth School of Business. His writing, research, and teaching have been recognized with many prestigious awards, and his work has been featured in the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, CNN, National Public Radio, among many others. He's also the author of Mindwise: Why We Misunderstand What Others Think, Believe, Feel, and Want. Nick lives in Chicago, and he and his wife are the parents of 5 kids. He's joining us now from Wisconsin, where he's on vacation with his family. So welcome, Nick.
Thank you, Sandy. It's great to be here with you all.
So I thought we'd just start with behavioral psychology. Can you explain what that is and how it fits in with the general field of psychology, and also how you became interested in this field?
Yeah, so behavioral science is kind of the broader category field that includes psychology and some sociology and some economics. We are a bunch of researchers who are just trying to understand human behavior and understanding our psychology, our beliefs, our thoughts, our attitudes, our intentions, our motives. Understanding those psychological processes are key to understanding behavior because they tend to precede it. If I can understand how somebody is thinking, I can typically anticipate their actions before they actually choose it. And so what we're trying to do is use the basic tools of scientific experimentation. I'm an experimentalist at heart, to try to uncover sort of general truths that are consistent across all of us, to try to understand how the mind works to guide our behavior, and sometimes to screw us up, and lead us to make mistakes, which is what I'm most interested in understanding.
And how did you come to choose this field?
You know, it's interesting. I could tell that story, but in many ways, it kind of chose me, which is I went to college. I wanted to be a biologist. I love being out in the woods where I am now. You can see, I got a deer head up on the wall. I spent a lot of time out in the woods. I grew up in rural Iowa. I went to college wanting to be a biologist. It's just I went to those classes and they were terrible. I just found them so boring. I couldn't manage it. But I took my psychology classes and I just found them deeply fascinating. I started doing research. It turned out pretty well. I applied to graduate school and I got lucky to get into Cornell when somebody dropped off of the wait list and allowed me to get into the PhD program. I applied to jobs when I came out of graduate school, and was fortunate to get a job at Harvard. That was my first faculty position, then moved to the University of Chicago. And each step along the way, things just kind of worked out. And I just followed where that led. It didn't feel like a choice. It just felt like I was following the path of least resistance. Well, not easy, but least resistance anyway.
Thanks. So one of the most striking things in the book is this whole idea of talking to strangers. And I
Okay.
think it's something that many people, avoid.
Yeah, it
Mhm.
is.
Why do you think there's such a strong avoidance?
Yeah, so So this has been really driving my research for the last 15 to 20 years, has been trying to figure out what strikes me as a really fundamental paradox that sits right at the core of human life, and talking to strangers is just a prototypical example of this paradox. And that paradox is that we're highly social creatures. And it's not a new insight. Aristotle articulated this centuries ago, that we are by nature highly social animals. Psychologists have only been building on that kind of intuitive insight. For decades, we've been documenting how important social connection is for our happiness. It is the single biggest determinant of our happiness and well-being day to day. It's critical for our health. So it turns out being well connected to other people is good for your health. It improves your cardiovascular functioning, improves your immune system. Feeling lonely or isolated is a psychological stressor, compromises your immune system functioning, compromises cardiovascular functioning, and makes you more likely to die sooner if you're poorly connected to other people. We're highly social creatures, and yet if you look around day to day, it strikes me there are lots of different places where we could reach out and engage with other people, but we choose not to. We hold back and avoid them. Talking to strangers is the textbook example. I opened the book with a eureka moment that I had on the train coming into Chicago, probably now a decade and a half or so ago, maybe 2010 or so, where I was sitting on this train, writing a chapter from my first book, Mindwise, describing how we're highly social creatures made happier and healthier by connecting. And then I looked around, and here we all were, highly social creatures. You could have heard a pin drop. Not a single person talking to each other that morning. It's not an entirely new phenomenon. This has been going on for a long time. And what we've learned over years and years and years and years of research now, over 120 published experiments, more than 30,000 people in our experiments, is that we have a reliable tendency, not just with talking to strangers, but with choosing how to connect with other people, how deeply to connect with other people, thinking about doing things that connect us with others, like random acts of kindness or expressing gratitude, being honest in our relationships. We find a robust tendency to underestimate how positively things will turn out when we reach out to connect with other people. And that's what I think keeps us from reaching out as often as would be optimal for our own well-being. We misunderstand how other people will respond to us.
Is it fear also? You have this great quote from Martin Luther King about fear in the book.
Yeah, yeah. So fear, in some way, that's a way to describe the avoidance motivation, right? We are nervous, pessimistic about how things will go if I turn to a stranger on the train to have a conversation, or if I actually try to have a meaningful conversation with you, or if I even do something like pass along a compliment to you about how awesome your red jacket looks, which is just a fabulous color, right? Matches your lipstick. It looks killer. We're nervous about how well that will be received. Fearful is another way to describe it. And in certain contexts, certainly it can morph into what would feel like genuine fear. But yes, that constellation of negative emotions about how things will turn out if I reach out to you is the thing that's keeping us from engaging with other people.
And in terms of our happiness, like it's kind of easy to have a quick conversation with, for us in New York, maybe with someone on the subway, a bus,
Yeah,
and you,
yeah,
how do you deepen that? Or does it even matter to our happiness if it's just
yeah.
like quick
So
and
that's interesting. My wife, for many years, as we were doing this work, she would, she, so no research I will say has ever changed the way I live my life more than this. It has now changed the way my wife lives her life, too. But for a long time, my wife was resistant for this very similar sort of thing, which is that, she would think, well, look, and I can have a nice conversation with somebody or meaningful conversation with somebody on the plane, but then it doesn't continue. And so what difference does it make? And the difference is all the difference, actually. What psychologists have learned is that happiness is really a function not of the intensity of the positive experiences that we have. So I will reveal to everybody on the call that you were on a cruise last week, which may come up later. That was a lovely time, right? You went on this wonderful trip. That's an intense positive experience, right? But then you come back and you're in New York traffic again, or on Monday, and you got all those same hassles that are coming back up to you again. When psychologists predict people's well-being or their happiness, what we find is it's not the intensity of positive experiences, it's the frequency of positive experiences that really predicts well-being over time. The moments really matter because you adapt to everything. Just everything. You adapt to everything, right? So you have a positive thing happen to you, and that's great. Negative things you also tend to adapt to faster than you think, right? But positive things you adapt to, you return back to baseline. And what that means is that not that you give up with being, happy if you just everything you do kind of slowly goes away eventually, but rather that you keep doing it. You think about social connection as a regular practice, focusing on those moments. And those moments, right? You turn a half hour ride in the morning better. You've made that half hour better by connecting or talking with someone. That's a good morning. You do that again in the afternoon, that's a good afternoon. You do that in the evening, and pretty soon you've strung together a good day. You do that a few days in a row, you're working on a good week. A few weeks in a row like that, you got a good month. That's what it looks like to live a good life. And some of those momentary connections do turn into meaningful things, right? Every friend you've ever had was a stranger to you at one point. Every spouse you've ever had in your life at one point was a stranger to you, right? So some of those do develop it. Even if they don't, you've made that moment better, and that is worth it. That's what happiness and well-being is about, is stringing together those good moments.
Can you tell the story of the person who started this subway club? I think that's something that people here will relate to.
Yeah, this was in New York, Claire Foyer. Actually, I met her. I was in New York City a few weeks ago speaking in Manhattan, and Claire and her family live out in Brooklyn. And it was a blessing for me to go out and meet them. It was lovely. If you find me on LinkedIn, you can see a story and some pictures I posted about her. Claire was a fascinating person to talk to. She reached out to me just with a letter first. She had heard me somewhere speaking and said, I got to reach out to this guy. She wrote me this lovely note, sent me some buttons. Claire's story is phenomenal. She was 14 years old, living in Brooklyn with her dad, Lauren. Her mom and dad have stayed close, but they've been separated for many years now. So it was just at her dad's house, even though mom lived close by. And she woke up in the middle of the night. Her bedroom, it was open to the like the courtyard in the back. And she woke up in the middle of the night and she saw like blue police siren lights on the ceiling. And she woke up, she looked, and she noticed the back door was open to her back bedroom. So she went and she shut the door. She thought maybe, she must have left it open. The wind blew it open or something. And when she closed the door, behind the door, there was a man standing in the corner, right? And she was just kind of, she wasn't quite sure what was going on. She thought, maybe it's the plumber here. Like, she was just very confused. Like what would happen when something really weird happens? You just kind of are confused for a little bit. Maybe it's the plumber. No, not the plumber. Maybe it's a friend of dad's. No. And then she has this realization. She said shock just went up through her entire body, from her feet all the way up to her head, that she realized it was a stranger. And she thought, this is it. And she realized, she just had this moment of realization where she thought, I have to have a conversation with this guy. And so she does. She sits him down on her bed, and she says, lays down some ground rules. You got to promise not to hurt us here. And then they just started talking. He agreed to that, and then they just started talking, trying to find things in common. They talked for many minutes until her father finally heard something going on, and she could hear him coming down the hallway. And she hid him away in the closet while she went to talk to Lauren outside. And I confirmed all of this in a call to Lauren as well. Lauren said, well, he can't stay here. He's got to leave. So they walked him out, and that was it. She never saw this guy again. But she said that conversation changed her life, because she realized the power that she had to control and to engage and connect with people through conversation. She could feel just how powerful and empowering that was for her to use her agency to have a conversation, even in an extreme moment like that. Because we can all easily imagine how she could have responded differently and maybe turned things very differently in that moment. There's actually there's even a famous example of this from October 7th in Israel. Rachel Edrei is her name, who was not far from Gaza when the terrorists attacked, when Hamas attacked. And she had 4 Hamas soldiers in her house, and she said they kind of looked like my sons, and she treated them as such. Of course, like the wonderful Jewish mother that we all have stereotypes of, she sat them down and fed them, of course, and then was able to leave, and they were captured. But Claire realized the power that she had to connect with people in conversation, and that stuck with her. And then when COVID hit in 2020, she she decided to start what I believe is the first, probably not the first, but the first that I know of at least, the first New York City subway social club, because she was tired of seeing people out, in public places, not using their power of conversation to connect with each other. It drove her nuts. Her mom worked for the transit system in Boston. And so she started the New York City Subway Social Club, and she talks with people all the time. I asked her, have you ever had a bad one? I remember this very vividly. As you might imagine, young woman, right? This is kind of dangerous and scary. Of course, she's choosing who to talk to, some too. And she said, I one time had a guy think I was trying to hit on him, but he said no. She said, no, I'm happily engaged. He said, oh, that's okay. And off she went, and that's how she lives her life. It's a very powerful story from her.
There are people though on, long flights or something
Yeah,
who will, view a chatty seatmate as,
yeah,
a nightmare evolving.
yeah, yeah. If you don't also take the power you have to end the conversation too. It turns out people respond more favorably to you saying, I got to go back to work here. I really like to read this book. They're not as offended as you think they are either. So just like you can start conversations more easily than you might imagine, at least we find in our research that people underestimate how well it'll go when they try to start a conversation with somebody. I think you can end them too a little more easily if you would like to. It doesn't mean all conversations go well, of course. Of course they don't. Our data suggests, though, they tend to go better than people expect, like Claire found.
Mhm. Are there guidelines? I want people who are listening to kind of stay safe.
Yeah.
Are there-
Well, so number one, it's worth asking um, the fear question. It's always right. You're always um, I sometimes liken it in the book. I liken the fear of talking to strangers to the fear of sharks, right, in the ocean, which is you ought to be afraid of sharks, right there. You ought to pay attention, but being worried that there are sharks everywhere. Sharks are the stereotypical thing that we are overly afraid of, and I think that's mostly true with strangers too, particularly when you're thinking about reaching out to other people who come up to you. That's a different story. That's not what our research is about. Our research is about the opportunities you have to reach out and engage with other people. And the question is, do you take those opportunities to reach out? Typically, when you're reaching out to someone, it's a random person who's like you or me or somebody's mother or father or son or daughter or whatever. But I think most people have good senses about what's relatively safe and what's not. Men and women may have different understandings of what's safe and what's not. Many of the women, or some of the women that I spoke to in the book, at least in their individual lives, when you take from the research where we don't find these gender differences to our individual lives where you might, they're careful they mostly talk to other women. And that's fine too. If you just took more of those opportunities you had to talk and opportunities where you felt comfortable and wanted to, you would I think you'd have a lot more enjoyable social interactions.
Talk a little bit about your research. How do
Mhm.
you construct these kind of experiments? And is there a difference between what happens in the lab and what happens, in the street, on the subway? In
Yeah, so that's one nice thing about the research that we do as a psychologist. I don't have to, mostly I'm interested in your beliefs, and I can ask you what those are. I don't have to get horribly sophisticated measurement. I don't have to get complicated equipment or study things with high degrees of fidelity with reaction times and things like that. I can just ask you how you think this conversation is going to go, essentially in different ways. How much you think you're going to enjoy it, how much you're going to like your partner, um, both before and after an experience. And with those tools, being able to measure your beliefs beforehand and your experiences afterwards, I can take that basic experimental design almost anywhere. So we can study conversations in the laboratory where we can record everything and analyze exactly what's said and how it's said. And I can also go to the trains in Chicago and recruit commuters and randomly assign them to tell me how they think their commute would turn out if they kept to themselves or talked to a stranger. And then I can actually recruit a group of commuters and have those do those two things, and see how people's expectations actually match up with reality. And so we can replicate the same kinds of experiments in the lab versus in the world, and that means that the effects that we find tend to be very very robust. We don't our experiments are not hothouse flowers. We're out in the world. We're out in the world doing these experiments.
Mhm. Yeah, one of the great things about the book are the footnotes. I think you sort of tell the
I
backstory
appreciate that.
often, and that
A reader after my own heart, Sandy. You've paid attention to the footnotes. Thank you.
um, is there something religious in all of this? I know as Jews we often think, everyone is created in the image of God, and we might
Yeah.
see people that way.
Yeah, so I was raised in a Lutheran church. My parents are my family's Christian, and but there are things that Judaism and Christianity have in common, and things that they don't. The big difference is in Christianity, beliefs are more central than practices in general, but it's the practices, it's the social practices that are common in religious institutions that really bring a lot of well-being and happiness. So the major world religions are largely, Judaism in particular, is oriented around a set of social practices that you can kind of think of as just good ways of living with each other. And these systems have evolved over centuries and centuries and centuries to help us live well with each other. One of my favorite Jewish traditions is what happens when somebody dies. And there's nothing you can say to somebody when somebody dies. Um, there's nothing you can do to fix it. People don't want to feel better after they lose somebody. But the Jewish practice of sitting Shiva, right? Did I get that right? Yeah. Just come into the home and you just are present. You just show up for somebody. That's just beautiful, right? That is beautiful. So that's where I really see the religious element. I sometimes think of it coming from the Christian tradition that I did. I often feel like I see um, I see Christ's beatitudes in some of our work. Be kind to people. That's a good thing. Turns out, in fact, it's more powerful than we think it is when you're kind to somebody. Express your gratitude and appreciation to someone. That feels has a more positive impact on somebody than you'd guess. Be open and honest with people in your relationships. That's surprisingly positive. Be social. Treat other people with civility and kindness. It's not just good for them, it's good for you as well. Not just good, but surprisingly good. I mean, if you could look at our work and say people didn't really believe their religious teachings as much as maybe they ought to. That's one way to look at it. Now there are lots of religious teachings, right? So you can pick and choose a little bit, but that's where I see a link between our work and many of the major religious traditions on the planet today.
This idea of, breaking bread together, that
Yeah.
people should, that somehow eating together, sharing our tables brings this to another level.
Yeah, absolutely. In fact, my colleague Ayelet Fishbach finds that food allergies actually create loneliness, in part because they make it hard for you to do that thing, to come together and eat with one another, commune with one another that way. That's one of the most kind of intimate things we do outside of our romantic relationships with somebody else is we eat together, right? And if you can't do that, it creates loneliness. But yes, those are central, those practices that bring us together with each other are central to both Christianity and central to Judaism as well. And what's interesting, psychologists for decades, this is not anywhere in the book, but I appreciate you asking me about it very much. Psychologists for decades have been interested in what's the relationship between religiosity and morality, or religiosity and well-being. So are people who are religious, are they happier, for instance? The answer is yes. The effect's not small, it's big. It has bigger effect than big increases in the amount of money you make, for instance, on your happiness. But that comes not so much from the belief part of religion as it does the practice part of religion. It's the people who attend services weekly, who participate in religious practices, who are part of that community. That's what brings happiness from religious belief, more than the belief itself. Those
Mhm.
practices.
I see. You mentioned loneliness a few moments ago. In what ways do you think that the book really speaks to this moment when loneliness is kind of rampant?
So I think the key insight from our research and the key like eureka moment for me that started me doing all of this research is recognizing that social connection is a choice. It's a decision we make to reach out and approach somebody, to engage with them, or to hold back and avoid them. And as a psychologist, I don't take the choices we make for granted as always being right. We don't always make wise choices. Our choices are guided by our beliefs and our attitudes and our expectations. Our social choices are guided by our beliefs about how other people will respond to us. And we can be wrong about those, which means we can mischoose. We can make bad choices, right? What's different in some ways now from over the course of human history isn't that our expectations about other people have changed. I don't really think that's true. What has changed is that we now have a lot more choice about how to engage, whether to engage, with whom to engage, than we ever did over the course of human history. We can be connected like this, right? So I have the opportunity to engage with you and all of your friends here, your entire community over Zoom this way. But I could connect with somebody else too. We can do this all the time. I can sit next to somebody and choose to connect with my son who's in Oregon right now, rather than the person sitting next to me. And that ability to have choice about connecting with other people, that's, I think, what's new. So any of these mistakes about how other people might respond to us, for most of human history, you interacted with people around you because you had to, like you just had to get along. Now we don't have to as much. And so I think that's really what has changed. So any of these mistakes that we make in thinking about how others will respond to us, the consequences of those are magnified when you can choose, if you want, to sit in your apartment in New York City all day long, never leave and talk to anybody because you can order your food on your phone. You can work from home, right? You can watch TV and entertain yourself. All choices you can make now that historically we haven't been able to make.
What about honesty? How important is honesty in these moments? And, or white lies, okay? What if somebody asks me something that I really don't want to answer?
Yeah, yeah. So honesty is an interesting one. It is the last. It's one of the last chapters in the book, and it's interesting because honesty, like many other choices, social choices we make, is guided by our beliefs about how somebody will respond to us, or even maybe how we'll feel about the thing that we when we're deciding to reveal something. And what we find in our research and what other people find in research as well is that we underestimate how positively honesty is received, in part um, because honesty contains in everyday life typically two components to it. One is the content of what I'm being honest with you about. So if you're a PhD student of mine, right, and I'm having to, we're working on a project and things aren't going well, I got to tell you, you got to get your act together. We got to get things going here. This isn't good work. We got to make it look like this instead, right? So I got to have a hard conversation with somebody. There's content there in what I'm conveying, right? But there's also character that's conveyed in the fact that I am being honest with somebody. So, one of the things psychologists find is that we tend to evaluate each other in terms of our warmth. We tend to be focused a lot on our competency, but when we evaluate other people, we tend to focus primarily on that person's warmth. And when you're honest with somebody, that is interpreted as warmth, right? As being friendly, as being decent, as being trustworthy. That's what we really want to know about each other. And when you are genuine with somebody, when you're authentic with somebody, when you provide honest feedback to a student, look, I want you to succeed here. In order for you to succeed, we got to figure out how to take some of these weaker points that we all have, including you, and make them better. That honesty is treated as it's seen as a positive signal. And that's why it tends to be interpreted a little more favorably than we would think. The other thing is that secrecy, so keeping things, not revealing things to other people, we often do that, at least about ourselves, and we hang on to negative thoughts about, things about ourselves. We hang on to that and not reveal it because we're worried about how other people will judge us. When we have people in our experiments reveal a secret they've been keeping about themselves from other people, they reveal it to somebody else, they tend to think they'll be judged more negatively by the other person than they actually are. And the tragedy with that, as Michael Slepian, who's a psychologist at Columbia University in the psych department, great guy, a friend of mine, has said about secrecy. The problem with it isn't that keeping secrets from other people is uncomfortable because you're having to evade things. Rather, it's because you got something that distances you from other people because you can't share it with somebody or feel you can't. Secrecy is creates loneliness, is what it does. And if we're overly reluctant to be open and honest and reveal meaningful things about ourselves to other people, we'll be choosing to keep ourselves at times overly isolated.
And then what about, conversations with people in our families, people who we're already close to? How do you like deepen those kinds of questions and interactions?
So some of it, I think, I don't know how much difference there actually is between how we would deepen a conversation with a family member versus a stranger, even. Like many of the conversations you have with family members are just as shallow, frankly, as the one you have with strangers, right? My dad, I was up here in Wisconsin with my dad and one of my sons. He turned 80 in May, and we were up here turkey hunting. We were out in the woods. I thought it would just be great to be with my dad out in the woods early in the morning, get dad a turkey on his 80th birthday. It didn't work out, but we had an amazing time. But I remember we went to dinner that night, and I've talked with, I love my dad. I mean, I love my dad to death. And we've had wonderful conversations, but often they're not. They're like, how are the tomatoes doing in the garden and stuff like that, right? Oh, you got a lot of snow this weekend. Yeah, I see that. Uh, but in this conversation, I asked him, Dad, turning 80. Tell Nathan and I what you've learned about how to live well. And I've never asked him a question like that before. I'm 51 years old. I've never asked him that before. And so the way you make a conversation deeper is you ask people to reveal meaningful things about themselves, their thoughts, their beliefs about stuff that are important to them, things that they value. That's what it means to ask somebody something deep, not shallow or superficial. Where do you live? What do you do? Those are often the conversations we have about with strangers, but things about how they feel about it, right? About emotions that are important to them. Do you love your job? Right? Not just what do you do for a living, but do you love your job? Is it your dream job? What are you afraid of these days? Right? Ask about emotions, ask about values, ask about meaningful beliefs. Those are the things that deepen conversations quickly. And we find that most people want to have deeper conversations than the ones they're typically having. And when they try to go deep in conversation quickly, they tend to go far better than people expect. You can have really meaningful conversations with people quickly if you choose to try.
Well, you open the book with I guess you're at a business meeting and you're about to suggest that the participants are going to, speak to each other in small
Yeah.
groups about these kinds of questions, and they're not very happy, but then
No,
it seems like you can't get them to stop talking once they.
exactly. Yes, I opened chapter 6 on deep conversation with the very first time I've run an experiment now. Over 5,000 people I've done this with. All of our incoming MBA students do this little experiment with me, which we've also replicated many times in the lab, where I have them have a deep conversation with somebody. I put questions up on the screen, things like, if I was going to become a good friend of yours, what would be most important for me to know about you? Can you tell me about one of the last times you cried in front of another person? And before they have their conversation, I have them tell me how they think the conversation is going to go, how much they're going to enjoy it, how much they're going to like their partner, how awkward it's going to be. They then go have the conversation. And then if I can get them to come back, they come back and they tell me how it actually went. And the gaps between their pessimistic beliefs beforehand and their actual experiences afterwards are massive. And the most memorable instance of this was the very first one that I ever ran, which was, I didn't say this in the book, but I can mention it here. It was at AQR Capital in Connecticut, run by a MBA student from the University of Chicago and Northwestern, Claire. So there we go. And Yeah, I put these questions up on the board, and the guy in the front row, right? These are like the financial masters of the universe or something at this financial decision making conference. They're not there to talk about the last time they cried in front of another person. Guy in the front row who's sitting next to one of my former colleagues, Toby Moskowitz, I remember very vividly. He just blurts out, "Ah, shit." at the at the start of it. I thought, oh my gosh, this is going to be a total disaster this session. And once I got him started talking, as I've now seen over and over again, it was hard getting them to stop.
Oh, thanks. I see we've got lots of questions coming in, but I had a few more things I wanted to ask. And I want to turn this to you a little bit. And I see that you teach a class to MBA students called Designing a Good Life.
Yeah.
What is that about?
The course is an ethics course, actually. And good life, the good in the good life title is multifaceted. The course assumes that our MBA students want to live a good life in three senses of the term. They'd like to be successful with what they do. They like to be good at work. They'd like to be ethical in what they do. Most people don't feel good when they're being schmucks. You could catch, in fact, many scandals, large organizational scandals, if you called the corporate sick lines, the hotlines, like at Wells Fargo, for instance, when they were opening fraudulent bank accounts, people were calling in sick because they didn't want to come to work in those days. And then the third way in which we use the term good is that people want to feel good. You want to be happy. And the question is, if you're one of our MBA students, how would you design an organization? How would you live your own life? How would you design your own life in a way that helped people achieve that life that I think we all want to live? So that's what the course is. It's one of only three ethics courses that are actually taught at Booth. It's a hard one to teach the students, but it's also the most rewarding thing I've ever done in class.
Uh, Another thing I wanted to ask you, I noticed the book is dedicated to Lindsay. Can
Yeah,
you tell us a bit about her?
it's my little angel right there. It's my Lindsay. Um, yeah, so I told you earlier that no work has ever changed the way I live my life more than this. I'm a different person than I had been. Once you see social connection as a choice you can make, and once you see the power that you have to lift other people up and to create connections, you just can't help but take those opportunities more often. You just become a friendlier person. Um, I'm a person who can talk to anybody, anywhere about anything now. And so it's affected a lot of small things, moment to moment choices that I make. I think it's made me though a better husband. I think it's made me a better father. And it's also affected some of the really big choices we make, and in a very clear way. And one has to do with Lindsay. I mean, Lindsay came into our lives largely because of the work that we did. On July 11th, 2016, we actually left our place here in Wisconsin and went back to Chicago. My wife was 6 months into a pregnancy, and we found out that day that our daughter had died. Sophie, we had already named her. She would have been our fifth child. We have four other kids, two adopted from Ethiopia, and two biological children. Um, and we found out at 3 months that she had had Down syndrome, and we were preparing for this. We were totally ready to go. We were excited about this. We called other families who told us, and they all used the word blessing to describe their children in their lives, who were raising kids with Down syndrome. And so when we lost Sophie, that just sucked. I'm sure there are plenty of people on this call who have gone through losses of that sort. And we sat for a year with um, it just feels like a hole in your life. Like there was a life that was supposed to be there that wasn't. And we were just in a funk. And it's about a year after I went into our sunroom one morning. We got two chairs sitting there, and my wife was sitting there having her coffee. And I said, honey, we were ready to have another baby, and we lost that opportunity. And we can do this again. We'd adopted before. There's still children who need parents. We can do this. We can do this again if you would be up for it. And she, without missing a beat, she said, "Would you be open to considering adopting a child with Down syndrome?" And that was not in my mindset at all. That's not where my mind was. I went back, my mind went right back to, 3 months into our pregnancy with Sophie when we got that diagnosis, which for any parent if you're not ready for it, it's kind of shocking. Oh my gosh, how are we going to do this? Is this going to ruin my life? Right? I was right back at that moment again somehow because my mind wasn't there. I mean, how are we going to even adopt a child with an intellectual disability like this? How are we going to be able to bring this child into our lives? How are we going to be able to connect with this child? How will this child love us? Right? And I had this eureka moment, kind, kind of as much like a lightning bolt as it was on the morning I was on the train a decade and a half ago, where I realized I'm a participant in my own experiment. Here, I have an opportunity to reach out and engage. My wife is totally on board with this. We're in a good place to do this. We have the resources to do this. I've got a job with flexibility to do this. We've got a very strong marriage. We can do this. And yet, here, I had all these fears about how well this would go. And I realized that those are almost surely misplaced. And it gave me some data-driven courage. I mean, it might seem weird to think um, about, consulting research like this or experiments about talking to people on the trains or having deep conversations to inform a decision like this, but it struck me psychologically as the same kind of choice, just jacked up, 100-fold. And it gave me some courage that, yeah, we can do this. And not only will it be good, it'll be surprisingly good. And it was empowering. I think that's really the message of our search. It's empowering. We can do more than you might imagine. And so we said yes. And in fact, it was not long later that we called the adoption agency that Jen had connected with already. And I remember they picked up the phone when we called them and we told them what we were wanting to do. And they said, "We have been praying for you every day." They showed us a picture of Lindsay, who we eventually named Lindsay, and that was it. About 9 months later, my four other kids and Jen and I were on a plane to China. We met Lindsay, this adorable, little roughly 2-year-old daughter with the, very hard start in life, but this relentless smile. And she has been every bit a blessing that all the parents we talked to said she would be. Hard, for sure, hard. All these amazing challenges, but every night I get to put her together, put her to bed at night. We read stories and then we spend time snuggling. Right? She just gives me a big hug around the neck till she's ready to go to bed, and then off I go. And she's a total blessing, total blessing. And that was very much felt inspired by our work.
Thanks for sharing that. You're amazing people.
I married an angel. That helps.
Thanks. Claire, I have lots more questions, but I see there people have
We have
things to
so
say.
many questions. Um, I'm struck. I'm struck by so much. So I'm gonna take a breath because I think that's always important. Thank you, both of you, for being in conversation. Many of our questions have to do with how we communicate with people, texting,
Yeah,
the phone, in
yeah,
person. Is
yeah.
there a difference?
Yes.
Tell us about that.
Yeah, so for sure. So there are meaningful differences that often escape people's expectations beforehand. Like when I talk to my kids, they'll tell me they talked to so and so, and I have to clarify with them, did you use your face parts or did you just type to them with your thumbs? Because they kind of equate those two things. They're not the same. So live voice interaction in particular, face to face has the benefit of being able to have physical touch. You can put a hand on a shoulder or shake a hand or hug. That matters a lot. But when it comes to feeling connected with somebody, the voice really carries a lot of information, more than we might imagine. The voice clarifies what it is we're communicating with somebody else so you understand each other better. The voice also includes a bunch of sometimes seemingly hidden things that connect us with each other. So when we're in live interaction with each other, your voice not only communicates what's on your mind, we find it also communicates that you have a mind. That is, it communicates that you're thoughtful, intelligent, rational. I can't see your mind, but it turns out people can hear it. So people sound more intelligent, more rational, more thoughtful when they hear what somebody has to say than when they read it. This includes in situations we've run experiments like just on the eve of the 2016 presidential election. You'll all remember this. This might be triggering um, for some of us. The Clinton-Trump election, the first one, right? Um, when people listened to what someone who was voting for an opposing candidate had to say about why they were voting for that candidate, they sounded more intelligent, thoughtful, rational, more human-like than when they read exactly the same thing. The voice contains a lot of additional information that humanizes you. The other thing that happens in live interaction, what doesn't happen in texting or typing to each other, is that conversation is inherently back and forth almost constantly. Um, when one person is talking, the other person isn't just sitting there silently like they are in an email, say. They're doing, Claire, what you're doing right now. You're nodding at me, right? You're smiling. If we were actually talking, you'd be giving me a mm-hmm, a yeah, right? That stuff is called back channeling. Linguists thought for decades that that kind of back channeling was just kind of noise. It didn't really matter. It turns out that stuff, those sounds that we make in the background, communicate interest and attention. And they show us somebody is paying attention to us and caring about us. And when you cut those out of conversation, you feel less connected to the other person. So, texting with each other leads to more misunderstanding, more disconnection from the other person. And so, it doesn't mean that you shouldn't type to each other sometimes. It allows you to connect with friends and family, people you already know, people you're already connected to. But if you got the chance to pick up the phone, I'm sure everybody on this call can resonate. Um, do it.
We have two more types of questions, and then Sandee, I anticipate you have a last question because you usually do. One I think speaks to. I just had a good segue, and then it got lost. But the age spread, diversity, like tell us more about who you're doing research with. Someone is wondering about age, gender, race,
Yeah.
education, geography. And I'm now thinking I got the thread.
Yep.
Generationally, right?
Yep. Yep.
How trends change and impact our communication. So all of that wrapped in one.
Yeah. So as researchers, as scientists, we conduct people experiments with people we can get in contact with. And that means there is some convenient sampling, of course, but we're also out in the world. So we're out in the streets of Chicago conducting experiments with people on sidewalks and in public parks and on buses and in cabs leaving Midway Airport and on trains in Chicago. We run experiments with our MBA students. I've done some deep conversations at a senior living center in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, called St. John's on the Lake, which struck me as a wonderful place to get old. If you're gonna get old, that's a good place to get old. I remember going into that center thinking, oh my goodness, this is an older group of folks. They'll understand all of this. They won't show these same gaps, underestimating how well a deep conversation will go. Turns out they showed even bigger effects than what I typically see. What I'll say is that when you see variability across cultures or across age or different types of people, what tends to explain that variability are differences in people's beliefs, not their experiences. So a good example is extroversion and introversion, right? That's a personality dimension that people vary some on. It doesn't explain a lot of human behavior, but explains a little bit. And what we find is that that personality dimension of extroversion and introversion predicts people's beliefs about social interactions, and therefore the choices they make and the habits they get into better than it explains their actual experiences. It's not that introverts don't enjoy connecting with other people and extroverts do. Both groups enjoy connecting with other people. It's that introverts tend to underestimate a little more how well it will go and therefore choose to do it a little less often.
Interesting. And I'm sure if we read the book, there's more there too.
A lot in the
And
footnotes too, as Sandee notes, if you want
mhm.
those kinds of details.
So I think our last bucket of questions, and then to Sandee, unless someone is really upset that I didn't ask their question or call on them. is connects to the 2016 election and what you alluded to. Several of us are talking about polarization today. Like, what do you
Yeah.
do if you strike up a conversation with someone and you discover that they are not thinking the way you are thinking? And what happens? What happens when we're speaking with someone and they say something insulting about our group or about
Yeah.
an opinion that we've expressed?
Yeah. So I'm not going to be able to tell anybody on this call how to have a conversation. That's actually not what our research is about. Our research is about the conversations we're not having, right? And the cases where you let your beliefs about what you think someone believes, or somebody doesn't maybe vote the way you do, or it seems like they don't think the way you do, and you don't even have that conversation to find out what their beliefs actually are. When we bring people together to talk across disagreement, they tend to think that the nature, the outcome of the conversation is going to be determined by the type of person they're talking to. They think they're going to enjoy talking with someone they agree with more than someone they disagree with. And that just turns out not to be very true in our data, that when people have conversations with someone they know they disagree with, they tend to report enjoying them as much as having a conversation. These are with strangers, as much as they enjoy having a conversation with someone they agree with. Now, that doesn't mean we've all had experiences talking with someone who we know and love, right, who disagrees with us, and those conversations don't go very well. Um, I think in lots of cases with family members, so the data I just described to you were strangers. I think in lots of the cases with like family members and friends, when we get into these conversations, we're maybe not as good a conversationalists as we could be. We stop listening. We start trying to persuade them or change their mind. We don't really try to understand. One of the best conversations I ever had about politics, actually, was at the end of my driveway at the house that I'm sitting at now, and this was about Donald Trump, uh, just before the 2016 elections, with a guy who was wearing a bulletproof vest and carrying a pistol with an AR-15 in the back of his car. He was the sheriff, the local sheriff, who came by to check on these Biden signs that we had on the other side of the road that had been run over and then stolen. I called him and just told him this had happened. He said, "Oh, I'll just come down." And then he asked me, after we were talking for a little bit, "What is it you don't like about Trump?" Those are conversations we're not supposed to have, right? We don't have with each other. Gosh, this is going to go poorly. In fact, we had a wonderful conversation for an hour. We were open with each other. We were honest with each other. We were curious with each other. We listened to each other. I got back to the house and my wife was panicked that I'd gotten into some sort of accident. "What happened to you?" Yeah. So my advice is not to keep your beliefs about other people from trying to have conversations. That's my advice.
Sandee, I'm gonna let you have the final word. We have a minute and change left
Advice.
together.
So I can't resist asking you to tell one more story. Um, you kind of got me with the Beatles lyrics in this one.
Yeah.
Uh, but I think it's one that surprised you, so it's particularly interesting. Can you tell us that, Chick-fil-A story with your wife and
Yeah. 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 This was I've had several good stories in Chick-fil-A, it turns out, over the years. Um, this is the Beatles lyric that Sandy is referring to comes from Hey Jude about being a fool by making the world a little colder. Um, and we were in Chick-fil-A, um, and I was standing there with the whole family. We're a scene when we travel, right? So, I got four, older kids and I'm holding Lindsay. Lindsay was not happy that day. We were trying to order, all the kids and Jen had ordered. I'm holding Lindsay. I'm trying to pay in the back. And a guy taps me on the shoulder. I turn around. He's an African American man. He's probably about 60. He's there with his son, who's probably about 30, I would guess. I'm assuming it's his son. And he's standing there holding me trying to hand me $100 bill. And he says, "I'd like to pay for this." And instantly I back off, "No, no, no, I'm okay. Thank you so much. That's so generous of you. But, I can handle this. We can do this." I kind of didn't want to, part of me didn't want to feel like I was in need, but I also, I didn't want him to think that I was in need in some way, and it just hit me like a bat to the face that I was being, again, a participant in my own experiments. We find that people underestimate how positively others will respond when you reach out and ask them for help, but also underestimate how positively others will respond, how positively others respond when you do an act of kindness for them. And here I was standing in line. Somebody was wanting to help me out of the kindness of his own heart because he liked the look of our family, I guess, or whatever it was we were doing. And here I was keeping him from experiencing that act of kindness, and I was keeping him from helping me at a time that would have made me feel better and him feel better. And I felt like a total idiot. Thankfully, I caught myself in that moment. I gave him a great big hug. I took that money with a big smile. I paid for it. It made me feel great. It made him feel great. And it changed me, fundamentally changed me. I was telling Sandee this at the beginning when I read the audiobook for the audio version of my book. There are lots of hard stories I talk about in there, lots of really emotional, powerful stories for me. But that was the only one that made me choke up while I was reading it. It caught me by surprise. It was a very powerful moment. There I was being a fool by making the world a little colder by refusing his help, and I have never done that again since.
Nick, thanks so much for your insight, your humanity, your generosity, and for your really excellent book. And thanks to everyone for joining us. But I encourage you all to buy and read A Little More Social. It's available at bookstores and also online. And you can also find Nick's other book, Mindwise. Also, please join us next week on Tuesday, the 14th, for a program with Pamela Gray, whose new musical, A Walk on the Moon, just opened off Broadway. So have a good evening. I hope we can all learn and have really great conversations with each other and with others. And this has really been a very memorable hour. So thanks, everyone. Thanks, Nick.
Thanks,
you, Nick.
everybody. It's been a
Thank you,
blessing being with
everybody.
you today. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Sandee. I'm looking forward to being in conversation and all that means. Thank you, everybody. I'm going to end the Zoom right now. Take care. Thanks again.